Thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor to have an opportunity to engage in a very important conversation. And folks who contacted me, they were just being efficient, and I appreciate that. Um, I want to start first by acknowledging uh, there's a commitment I have, and that is every public conversation now. I am acknowledging the existence of political prisoners in the United States. We have captives who are now facing their fifth decade in prison, and we want the world to know that the longest imprisoned political prisoners on the planet are in the United States of America. So let me get into the conversation in this way. Um, I want to first talk about this concept of race. We want to dismiss the notion that the issue of race and white supremacy is something that is just really confined to the West. Um, and to give a sense of how this issue of race and white supremacy informs all of the contemporary policies that we see, in fact, coming out of the West, and how we understand what is unfolding in the United States at this current moment. So let me talk about race for a second. As we know, and I'm sure your students know, that race is a social construct that emerged and took shape coming out of the 1492 European invasion and violent conquering of the people of what became the Americas and the introduction of the African slave trade. So it was intimately connected to the colonial project. We refer to this whole process as the pan-European, white supremacist, colonial, capitalist patriarchy. The invasion created the material foundations of what became Europe, as Fanon pointed out. This Europe eventually imposed its hegemony on every part of the world. We still live in a divided world. Coloniality is, in fact, real. There's no post-colonial in the sense that every independent, even independent nations are forced to operate within the context of global structures produced by the global US, European, colonial, and imperialist power relations. So we're not interested in race or anti-racism. We see the structure as one of power. And let me elaborate on what we mean by that. I'm going to share with you the definition that we operate from in the Black Alliance for Peace, a new formation that was formed 3 years ago on April the 4th, 2017, to commemorate the year that Dr. King broke his silence on Vietnam and took a definitive position against U.S. warmongering and announced his Poor People's Campaign. And we thought that was an apt date to relaunch a Black anti-war, anti-imperialist movement in the United States, especially after 8 years of reaction represented by the ascendancy to power of the first Black president, Barack Obama. So our definition of white supremacy, we say it is the combined ideological and structural expressions of white power. It is, in its ideological expression, it posits that the descendants of people of the territory referred to as Europe represent the highest examples of human development. Their culture, social institutions, a way of life are inherently and naturally superior. This is what we call the global structures and institutions of white supremacy, the material means to maintain and advance global white power. Examples of these institutions and structures are the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the global banking system, NATO, and of course, dollar hegemony. So for the Black Alliance for Peace, race or white supremacy cannot be reduced to individualized attitudes and values just among people identified as so-called white. Instead, it should be seen as a structure of domination that is also ideologically embedded into every aspect of U.S. and European society to the extent that it has become normalized and invisibilized as general common sense. White supremacy is fundamental to the pan-European colonial capitalist patriarchy that began, as I said, with the invasion in 1492. So white supremacist ideology not only informed and rationalized the colonial, but is still the current dominant ideological tendency among policymakers in the West, but it has also infiltrated through cultural imperialism all aspects and thought and culture globally. Effects of global whiteness is experienced at different levels of intensity around the world, but its effects are nevertheless there. Examples of Japanese people getting surgery to their eyes to round them out so they look more Western. Skin lighteners in Africa and other parts of the world to try to become closer to white. Color consciousness with whiteness at the apex of some of the manifestations of this global malady. But it's important to understand this. Non-Europeans tend to underestimate the degree in which white supremacist ideology structures the psychic dimensions of U.S. and European publics. You cannot completely understand U.S. And European policies outside the framework of the white supremacist worldview. Murderous sanctions, warmongering, the war on terror, and all dependent on the deeply ingrained assumptions about the racialized others. Your lives do not matter, okay? Even the white saviorism that we see in the U.S. and in Europe, you know, when the white saviors informed by this notion of humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect, what they're really motivated by is this notion of coming to the aid of those peoples around the world who are aspiring to become associated human beings. That is, aspiring to become white, which is really an impossibility, but they can become close to white. So those movements, those people who aspire to be like the West, these are the and the U.S. will come to their aid under the guise of humanitarian intervention and protecting something that they call human rights. So in the United States, this understanding is becoming more and more clear. We want to connect this understanding of how this phenomenon operates globally with what we are seeing in the United States. We say that this, the popular claim that Trump's election signified a resurgent white supremacy is not only wrong, it's dangerous. It is a conservative construction that reinforces the mythology that one, Democrats are not responsible for racism and are friends of people of color, and two, is ahistorical because the U.S. was the first nation ever constructed on the basis of race. It was conceived as a white nation with its national identity grounded in the assumptions of white supremacy that justified the concept of manifest destiny, the notion that their Christian God had given the landmass to the settler colony, to the white settler colonies, and therefore they had a mandate from God to engage in a murderous expansion across the territory that became the U.S., conquering and slaughtering the first Americans, or the indigenous people of that land, in order to establish their new nation. And the enslavement of Africans, ahistorical in the sense that it was this conquering of the indigenous, the enslavement of Africans, and then the 100 years of apartheid after so-called slavery ended in 1865, that shaped the politics in the United States. And third, this notion of Trump, and Trump representing some kind of aberration, diverts attention away from the ongoing structural violence of capitalism experienced by African Americans and other colonized people in the country. And fourth, it limits the range of acceptable political discussion to minor reforms, something called racial justice, or justice for George Floyd, whatever that is supposed to mean, without addressing the issues of the relationship of power between African Americans and the state. So what we are seeing, my friends, in the United States is an eruption that is fueled by not only opposition to so-called racism, but the white supremacist structures in the United States. The resistance or the street actions to the George Floyd murder was almost a metaphor for the kinds of dehumanization and degradation that not only Black people in the United States are experiencing, but many other people in the U.S. That basically what we see in the U.S. is an eruption against a system of oppression. That an understanding of what is unfolding in the U.S. Cannot just be limited to a desire on the part of Black people to want to be a part of an oppressive structure. That therefore our responsibility is to rebel against our status of colonization. We recognize we are part of the global order. We identify with those colonized people and people who are aspiring for national liberation. We see our connection with those movements, see ourselves as part and parcel of that. And you're going to see that kind of pivot toward that kind of politics as we go forward. So race is not a phenomenon restricted to white folks or to the U.S. It is part of the colonial capitalist order. And we're seeing that there is a real shift in understanding of that and a real shift toward understanding of the global solidarity that all of us have to go forward to build a new world. Thank you.
Very good. Very good. Let me ask a question, Dr. Baraka, on your last sentence, global solidarity. What do you think people in Iran, non-governmental organizations, individuals, academic community, students, what do you expect them to do, the people who are in Iran and are going to watch your video later or are watching you now?
First, we would expect that they recognize that there are forces in the United States for peace. They want to see normalized relations between the United States and Iran. That suggests that there is a people-to-people connection here. And therefore, it would be very valuable for those of us in the United States to hear from the Iranian people a condemnation of the human rights crisis that Black people and other working class people are facing in the United States